Hello, and welcome back to Source, a podcast by the Canadian Teachers Federation produced on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I'm Julie Namwako of the Public Affairs team, and today we're pleased to share the recent webcast of our national panel discussion, Violence in Schools, Beyond Quick Fixes. This live discussion explored what violence in schools looks like, why it's a growing problem, and the solutions needed to make schools safer for educators and students alike. It was originally recorded on April 14th, 2026 in Ottawa, Ontario. Speakers included Dr. Darcy Santor, cross-appointment professor at the University of Ottawa, Éric Pronovost, président de la Fédération du personnel de soutien scolaire, Sherry-Ann Bowen-Gordon, provincial executive officer at the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, Norberta Heinrichs, president of the British Columbia School Counsellors Association, and the panel was moderated by Clint Johnston, CTF FCE President. This session was held in English and French and is presented in the speaker's original language. Alors la séance est présentée en anglais et en français selon la langue des intervenantes et intervenants. Be sure to check out the episode description for links to related resources, including new national public opinion data conducted by Abacus Data. Tune in to hear about why violence is not an isolated behavioral issue and how we can move beyond short-term responses.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome. I am Cassandra Hallett, Executive Director at the Canadian Teachers Federation. Thank you for joining us, both here in Ottawa and from across the country online. Bonjour à toutes et à tous et bienvenue. Merci de vous joindre à nous, que vous soyez ici à Ottawa ou ailleurs au pays. We would like to sincerely recognize and welcome parliamentarians, guests, CTF-FCA Board of Directors members, partners, and educators who are with us this evening. Welcome. Thank you for joining us here and in person and also online. If you are already familiar with the Canadian Teachers Federation, thank you for your continued support and engagement. If not, please let me share a few words about our federation. The Canadian Teachers Federation is Canada's largest bilingual alliance of teachers and education workers working collectively to strengthen public education. The CTF-FCA represents a national network of over 370,000 teachers and education workers represented through their provincial and territorial teachers' unions and associations. Tonight, we aim to engage in a thoughtful and honest conversation about violence and aggression in Canadian schools, understanding why it is occurring and what changes are necessary. This is a complex issue, I would say highly complex issue, that impacts students, educators, the broader public education system, and our communities. We are honored to be joined by leading voices from academia, education unions, and those working on the front lines of public education as we explore this issue and seek solutions together. Without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Darcy Santor, who will set the stage for this important conversation. Darcy Santor received his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and Philosophy from the University of Western Ontario in 1989 and completed his doctoral degree in clinical psychology at McGill University in 1995. Over the past 30 years, he has worked in a number of clinical, workplace, and school settings, that's an important note, where he has investigated various aspects of mental health in children, young adults, and adults, as well as the impact of the chronic exposure to violence and harassment in educators and education sector workers. Alongside this research, Darcy has treated individuals of all ages for a variety of conditions and disorders affecting their performance and well-being, both at school and in the workplace. Darcy is currently a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Ottawa, where he trains doctoral candidates in the treatment of various disorders and conditions and oversees important research studies investigating mental health in school and workplace settings. He regularly speaks to students, parents, and professionals about a wide range of mental health topics. Please join me in warmly welcoming Darcy Santor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon. 3 decades, long days and short years. It passes quickly. I've been asked to set the stage. Educators have always faced behavior that was inappropriate, whether it was from students, parents, or colleagues. That was part of the job, but it used to be rare. Over the past 2 decades, the rate of violence and harassment has increased dramatically. Since 2019, my colleagues and I at the university have surveyed thousands of students, thousands of educators, education sector workers here in Ontario and across the country. We've documented alarming rates of harassment and violence. We found that in any given year, 80% of educators and education sector workers will experience at least one act of physical violence, a threat of physical violence, or an attempt. More than 80% will experience harassment. Those are rates. Averages are even more alarming. Some 20 to 25 to 30 incidents of violence or harassment in a single year. For the group that is most exposed, this is virtually every week. It affects everyone who is in schools, and the impact is considerable. We looked at single worst incidents of violence and harassment in a year. Those who experience that, 1 in 4 will experience symptoms of PTSD, severe enough, impairing enough to be designated as having PTSD. Our surveys also show that 1 in 6 will report being at risk or already experiencing burnout. Almost 1 in 2 will report that they would leave their jobs if they could. We are now experiencing a shortage of teachers across the country. None of this is new. Teachers and education sector workers have known this for a long time, and despite efforts to address this national crisis, little to no improvement has been achieved. If anything, it is getting worse, in some instances, much worse. The response of government has been inadequate. It has largely ignored the underlying issues. We know that there is chronic underfunding. However, this underfunding narrative, in my view, has not worked. It only captures part of the problem. Better student-to-teacher ratios is also important, but it will not address the underlying problem. I've argued that the narrative needs to be changed. Schools have become hazardous workplaces. School is unsafe. It's unsafe for educators, for education sector workers, for a good number of children who witness instances of violence and harassment, not only against each other, but towards the teachers who are responsible for teaching them and keeping them safe. I've argued for a change in the narrative for 2 reasons. Schools are dangerous. They're unsafe. That captures what's really going on. I've also argued that it needs to be changed because the old narratives have not worked. School is an important public institution. True. Quality, publicly funded education is part of the Canadian identity. Also true. Publicly funded education is important for our quality of life. All of that is true, and it has not made a bit of difference. You've asked for an honest conversation. We are at a tipping point. When you look around, we are at a moment, this is a canary in the coal mine moment when things need to change. They're only getting worse. Thank you very much.
That's amazing. That does indeed set the stage. So I'm not gonna say much other than to introduce my panelists because I'm really excited to hear from them. So first, starting farthest from me, Sherry-Ann Bowen-Gordon. Sherry-Ann is a speech language pathologist in the York Catholic District School Board and a provincial executive officer with the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, OSSTF FEESO. Originally from Barbados, she holds a Master of Science in Education from California University of Pennsylvania, where she attended on a volleyball scholarship. A committed union leader, she served 6 years as a bargaining unit president and played a key role in organizing the PSSP unit at York Catholic. She represents members across Ontario, advancing equity, inclusive leadership, and strong public education, and is also actively engaged in community leadership, serving on the board of directors of a nonprofit housing corporation. Welcome, Sherry-Ann.
Thank you.
Our second panelist, Éric Pronovost. Éric Pronovost préside depuis le 1er juillet 2013 la Fédération du personnel de soutien scolaire, FPSS-CSQ, qui représente 43 000 membres. Il a auparavant occupé différentes fonctions à la vice-présidence. Son parcours syndical débute en 2003 à titre de conseiller responsable des services de garde dans un syndicat local, avant d'en devenir vice-président puis président. Reconnu pour sa rigueur et sa détermination, il ouvre au rayonnement et à la croissance de la FPSS-CSQ en collaboration avec 20 syndicats affiliés, ouvrant dans 25 centres de services scolaires et commissions scolaires. Il occupe fréquemment l'espace public afin d'assurer une représentation forte du personnel de soutien sur la scène nationale. Welcome, Éric. And then last beside me, Norberta Heinrichs. Norberta's teaching career began in a rural K-12 school in British Columbia in 1990. For over 25 years, she taught a range of subjects from grades 3 to 12 before serving as president at the local union office. After completing her master's in counseling psychology in 2016, she began working as a high school counselor and as a registered clinical counselor in private practice supporting adults. She is currently the president of the BC School Counsellors Association, a provincial specialist association of the BCTF, and she serves on the board of directors for the BC Association of Clinical Counsellors. Welcome, Norberta. So that was quite an introduction. I appreciate it, actually, very frank. So you all have a lot of experience, broad and deep in this field. Can you, each of us, and I'll start with you, Sherry-Ann, if that's okay, walk us through how you think, how you feel, how you've noticed that the issue of aggression and violence in schools has changed during your time working in the system?
Thank you, Clint, and welcome everyone. So I've been a speech language pathologist for over 20 years, as Clint mentioned. And one of the things that we would say was the core of service delivery back in the day was early intervention. So before kids even set foot in schools, they had access to assessments, they had access to community supports, there were preschool speech and language programs, there were behavioral supports. So they had a leg up coming into schools. And schools also were better prepared because we had the opportunity then to have these students who had already been serviced in some form or the other to come into the schools. We already had a kind of preparation plan to deal with that. Now the system has shifted to more of a reactionary system. So we are looking at overfunded, overcrowded classrooms, more complex needs. We know we've heard about COVID. COVID played a part in what we're seeing right now, but it is not the real reason. It just exacerbated some of the issues that we have in schools. Back in 2023, OSSTF completed a survey on workplace violence, and the results were not surprising, but they were still astonishing. 75% of our members had experienced workplace violence throughout their career. And that's not only from our union. This was consistent messaging from across all of the education unions. So what we are seeing is an increase in frequency, an increase in intensity. And I'm going to be very frank. I put where we are right now squarely at the feet of the Ontario government. Okay? We are chronically underfunding. The number is staggering. $6.3 billion out of the system since 2018. Okay, that is unprecedented numbers that can contribute to a lot of the issues that we are seeing in schools. we have limited access to mental health professionals. We have large class sizes. We have limited specialized placements for students, okay? And so at the end of the day, we have solutions that could be help to mitigate where we are, but we do not have access to the funding in order to help address these needs.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Éric.
Tout d'abord, merci de nous avoir invités. Merci pour la belle invitation. Écoutez, oui, au Québec, la violence a vraiment augmenté. Vous savez, cette violence-là envers les élèves, envers le personnel. Oui, il y a la violence physique, mais au-delà de ça, il y a l'intimidation, mais il y a aussi beaucoup au fil des ans, les gouvernements ont mis en place des plans de lutte. Et vous savez, un plan de lutte contre la violence et l'intimidation. À partir de ce moment-là, il faut quand même que ce plan de lutte-là arrive dans les milieux et qu'on puisse utiliser les outils qui sont en jeu. Trop souvent, ils n'atteignent pas l'école et donc, on a une problématique par rapport à ça. Au début, les plans de lutte, c'était une application qui était très variable. Donc, oui, de temps en temps, non, pas tout le temps. Maintenant, c'est passé à obligatoire. Donc, c'est différent parce qu'ils ont l'obligation maintenant de mettre un plan de lutte, bien entendu. Tout à l'heure, ma collègue disait, depuis la pandémie, nous, on a constaté qu'il y a une augmentation vraiment marquée de la fréquence, de l'intensité des gestes, la diversité des gestes de violence. Mais ce n'est pas plus seulement de la violence physique. On voit de plus en plus, oui, la violence psychologique, on voit aussi la violence à caractère sexuel, mais on voit énormément de cyber-intimidation. On le voit davantage dans les écoles secondaires, donc les endroits où il y a un peu plus de manipulation et les adolescents comprennent le principe de l'ordinateur, de texter, etc., du téléphone cellulaire. Mais la violence qui est vécue par le personnel de soutien, bien entendu, il a été trop longtemps banalisé. Il a été trop longtemps normalisé. Moi, j'ai des exemples concrets d'éducatrices, d'éducateurs, des techniciens en éducation spécialisée, des gens qui nous disent, quand la direction le rencontre, avertissent ces techniciennes-là ou ces éducatrices-là en leur disant, tu le sais, hein, William, quand il va revenir de sa fin de semaine, c'est normal, il va te donner des coups de pied et des coups de poing. Donc, à partir de là, non, ce n'est pas normal, ce n'est plus acceptable. Et vous savez, pour régler un peu la violence, il faut y aller par plusieurs étapes. Nous, ce qu'on a fait, c'est que premièrement, on a documenté la violence. On a fait des sondages 2018, 2022, 2024. Le constat est sensiblement les mêmes que tout à l'heure, les chiffres qui nous étaient présentés. La deuxième étape, c'est de le faire connaître publiquement, que les membres de notre fédération, de l'ensemble des gens qui travaillent en éducation au pays subissent cette violence-là. Je pense que la population doit en prendre conscience et il faut mettre en place des solutions pour que ces gens-là comprennent bien ce qu'on vit au quotidien. Et vous savez, troisièmement, c'est amener doucement notre personnel à ne plus la normaliser, la violence, à ne plus la banaliser. Et ça, souvent, on est des gens qui travaillent de cœur, qui travaillent pour les enfants, pour les étudiants, qui travaillent avec une passion incroyable, mais trop souvent, on s'oublie et je pense qu'il faut passer à autre chose. Il faut vraiment, on a une éducation à faire entre nous. Je ne vous dis pas d'être plus dur, mais il faut juste moins endurer. C'est comme ça que je le vois aussi.
Merci, Éric. Norberta, thoughts?
Well, some wonderful thoughts and experiences have been shared already, so I'm really going to try not to be repetitive. I will agree wholeheartedly that it begins right pre-K and K. We know that in the classroom that students that are entering are not ready. Some of them haven't even been toileted. Some are absolutely dysregulated. They don't have a system that can sit still at the carpet And then we're tasked for them to be able to regulate themselves and not communicate it in ways through violence and aggression. And then it perpetuates. And what we see is that children that are really struggling in school, and it even happens before that, because let's look at Maslow's hierarchy, when they're not fed, clothed, and housed, and these are like a national crisis that we're facing, they're coming into these schools without these needs being met. And then a teacher who's not a social worker, who's not a clinical counselor, who is not a speech language pathologist or a specialized in learning support services, is expected to not only co-regulate them for the entire day, but then get them to build some literacy and numeracy skills moving on forward. As that happens and that progresses, the lagging skills that students face and suffer through, those lagging skills, perpetuate the aggression, perpetuates that level of discomfort for the child. And when they do act out, we are still tasked as teachers, as specialists, as all staff in the school, to do with what we can, meet them where they're at, and do the best we can to support them. This is why we have teacher burnout, because burnout is the direct correlation between the hopes and wants of the professional to meet the needs of the children and what the resources actually allow them to do. There's where the burnout. So when there's a greater discrepancy, the burnout will be quicker and deeper. And we know this. And so it's just really important that when we normalize that system of aggression and violence, we also have a system that doesn't support the worker to be able to document, talk about, relate their experiences in terms of of witnessing violence. Not even, we've already heard about children witness to violence, rooms being cleared to be able. So what is that impact to children, to the adult? And the BCTF also did a survey around the same time. And I read through some of the anecdotal reports, and it was heartbreaking to hear teachers saying, I want to leave the profession. I can't make change. I went into the profession because I believe that I could help children and teach them and bring wonderful experiences to them. And then I can't do that. I can't do that because I have to clear the room. I can't do that because children are suffering. I can't do that because I don't have the resources to meet their needs. And this is all interrelated. This is all interrelated, and that's why it's a complex problem to solve and address. But early intervention programs, I've found, not only in my jurisdiction and in other areas, they've been removed, or they have been removed entirely, or they've been massaged into some other type of programming that doesn't address the issue and doesn't support the professionals in the building to do the job that they need to do. But it starts early, and we can see that. Ask any grade 2 teacher if a child is going to struggle in the future with regulation, with their academics, with their literacy and numeracy, but principally with their ability to make friends, to keep friends, to not get into conflict. And they can give you an entire profile. And yet again, we articulate, meaning we talk about these students and the needs of these students every single year till they're grade 12. And there hasn't been a comprehensive intervention, holistic intervention, and I'm talking now just the literacy, numeracy, but also talking the mental health, and if there's social emotional needs, but a fulsome intervention to make change.
Thank you very much, Norberta. I'm I'll give you a warning. I'm going to talk a little longer to let you catch your breath, but I'm going to come right back to you, partly because you did such a great segue into the second question, which is we're talking about education very specifically here. But let's face it, we're not in a vacuum. Schools are part of a community. They are an extension of a community. They're interwoven. So I'm interested in your thoughts on, and this is what I mean, you touched on this about how the youngest children are coming to school, certainly. How do you think, let's call it home contexts, social context, what's happening in the world now beyond that, and a lack of supports, and you've already all defined the lack of supports in the school, but in general, outside of schools, a lack of supports on these issues. I'm interested in your thinking and how that plays in, partly also because we're very focused on students and student on student or student on teacher, but let's face it, we do interact with adults as well, and the social world is changing and has an impact. So I'm interested in your thoughts on step out of the school into what's there and what's not there, and the context that's going on, and how you think that's impacting what's happening in schools.
Well, I could start just saying communities are really suffering. Communities are really struggling. Everything from trying to have quality time with their children in between working and all the commitments and needs of the family. Families are having a real difficulty in accessing resources. And we know that families are more isolated than ever before. The loss of community. And that's why schools are so important, because school is, for some children, it's the first idea and feeling of community that they ever experience. For some. Not for all, but for some. And then just again, I think before there used to be more supports around for parents in terms of readiness, in terms of children in say they're in the school environment, they're going to be working with other children, they're going to be doing hard things. And I think we've lost that structure, that framework in terms of supporting parents in what does that look like? How does that look like? I know that our pre-K and our daycares, and there's been so many initiatives about daycare, and they're so fundamental, but we're finding that not everybody can access that. And we see it. We see this, the families that are not accessing the resources. And that's where we see inequity in a really early glance. We really can see that inequity, and it shows throughout the child's career.
Thank you very much, Norberta. Éric.
Ben, nous, on a identifié une problématique majeure, c'est que au Québec, les différents ministères qui peuvent donner de l'aide aux parents, qui peuvent travailler en support avec eux, ministère des Affaires santé, services sociaux, ministère de l'Éducation, les différents organismes communautaires, police jeunesse, tous ces gens-là qui travaillent autour de l'école, rarement viennent travailler avec les intervenants à l'école. Mais ne viennent pratiquement pas souvent non plus travailler avec les parents. Il faut faire un lien. Il faut qu'on tisse un lien, il faut qu'on tisse une relation ensemble pour justement que ces parents-là qui vivent des difficultés, parce que il faut prendre que souvent, on parle de violence, on discute de ça, mais souvent, là, l'école est la piste d'atterrissage de la violence. Ça part d'un endroit, ça part d'une source, ça part d'une situation, qu'elle soit familiale, qu'elle soit gang de rue, qu'elle soit, peu importe, dans les gens que tu fréquentes. Donc, pour nous, il faut absolument tisser des liens. Nous, ce qu'on a proposé au gouvernement, c'est d'avoir des techniciennes en travail social, des gens qui sont capables, des intervenants qui partent de l'école avec les professionnels pour être capables d'avoir des relations et d'essayer de comprendre les différents milieux, mais à la base. Ça demande du travail, mais pour régler des situations, il faut toujours bien aller à la base du problème. Et si le problème part de là et qu'on est capable d'en éviter, moi je dis toujours, on dit souvent à la Fédération du personnel de soutien scolaire, on veut travailler en amont, pendant et en suivi. Donc, c'est la recette pour faire avancer tout ça, mais d'être capable d'avoir du temps de concertation, du temps pour pouvoir jaser entre nous, entre équipes, pour pouvoir se tenir au courant d'une situation. Et on va plus loin jusqu'à dire que pour nous, la petite enfance devrait être associée au milieu scolaire. Parce que l'enfant qui est dans un centre de petite enfance 4 ans, qui a des difficultés, on ne peut pas attendre en 2e année pour lui donner un diagnostic, là. Il faut qu'on ait un lien entre, qu'on puisse être capable de pouvoir s'échanger l'information, se donner de l'information, d'être capable que autant nos enseignants, autant notre personnel de soutien et professionnel soient capables de faire face à la situation en amenant les meilleurs outils possibles dès le plus jeune âge. Parce que de plus en plus, on en a beaucoup de situations de violence par rapport à ça. Il ne faut pas oublier que les parents aussi, il y a le contexte socio-économique qui n'est pas facile pour eux, là, hein? Toute augmentation du coût de la vie, on a de la difficulté à joindre les deux bouts. Les logements sont rendus épouvantablement dispendieux, la violence conjugale, les familles monoparentales et de plus en plus de problèmes de santé mentale. Donc, vivement, une relation entre l'école et les organismes autour pour travailler ensemble, unir notre expertise ensemble. Je pense que ça va passer par là. Parce que tant et aussi longtemps qu'on n'agira pas avec les acteurs autour aussi de l'école, ça devient ingérable et ça prend des gens pour pouvoir travailler activement sur ce dossier-là. Mais on se fait souvent répondre, vous savez, combien ça coûte votre projet, M. Pronovost? Hein? C'est toujours ça. On commence toujours par me dire ça. Ça m'agace beaucoup parce que pour moi, l'éducation, tant aussi longtemps qu'on va la régler en règles budgétaires, on ne réglera jamais rien. Mais si on règle et on travaille en fonction des besoins humains, c'est sûr et certain qu'on va atteindre des objectifs. Peut-être pas parfait comme objectif, mais on va les atteindre. Ça, c'est certain. Merci.
Merci, Éric.
So totally agree with what my colleague said. Schools, they don't exist in a bubble. We know that schools have become, you said, the landing point, I say the converging point. When we think about the pressures that families are facing now, when kids get to school, they don't leave that pressure at the door and somehow become a different kid when they walk through the door. So we know that families are struggling. We know that they have less resources to provide to their kids, less time. And we don't know what some of these individual kids are going through. We don't know when a kid has come to school without breakfast. We don't know when a kid has gone to bed without dinner, right? We are not aware if a kid is sleeping on a friend's couch because their family doesn't have access to housing. So one of the things that we need to look at is how can we as an education system fill in the blanks, but we're not expected to be the only solution. So educators, you had mentioned earlier that educators now are expected to manage trauma. They're expected to manage mental health. They're expected to manage complex social challenges, along with everything else that we have to do. And we know that parents are frustrated. We know that parents are legitimately frustrated because they know that they're going through struggling times, they bring their kids to school, and they know they're not getting the supports, the resources, the class time, the management that they need to be successful. And this is a broader issue. This is an issue that speaks to the underfunding that is not only central to education, but we're seeing it in healthcare. We are seeing it in social services. There has been phenomenal cuts across the board, and therefore we do not have the strategies and the tools for which to have a successful school system.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate all your responses. It's fantastic. I'm facing the issue I was worried about. It's such an amazing conversation and such helpful input. So I'm going to skip around, apologies staff, and ask 2 more questions, and I'll get pretty quick fire answers to them if we can. I'm not going to ask about maximum student to teacher ratios or about minimum supports for students with special needs. I feel like what you've all said in answers to your questions already make that a given. That is a thing that is needed, should be happening already. We can look at why it isn't some other time. But what I do want to talk about, when we polled people recently on this across Canada, 77% of respondents did think that the federal government has a role that they should be taking action on violence in schools, even though education is primarily a provincial and territorial jurisdiction. So there's 3 things I want to quickly have you think about and respond to, which is options that we had put forward. And all the options we put forward had good pickup. on the polling, people were interested in them. So the one is creating a federal transfer specifically for mental health. We already have health transfers from the federal to the provincial and territorial, but we're talking about a specific mental health one, purely for mental health costs, and creating a federally funded support program for students with special needs that goes directly to schools or school boards. That was the second we proposed that had good pickup. And then the final one is a minimum percentage of federal GDP going to provinces and territories specifically for the K-12 education issues they're doing. So just very quickly, I'll get your thoughts on those. And I'm going to start with you again, Sherry-Ann, if I may. I promise Éric, since je parle en anglais tout à l'heure, I wouldn't ask him first.
Yeah, no, that's fine. The fact that 77% of the public believe that the federal government should get involved just speaks to the totality of this problem. This is not just a school board problem. And I think the public is ahead of the policy by understanding that this is more than just a school board problem. Yes, the federal government could play a role, especially where provinces are failing and where the funding is not adequate. A federal transfer dedicated to mental health could help if the money is prescribed, if it's protected, and if it is tied to services for children. In the past, we've seen transfers earmarked, and that funding, we have no idea where it ended up. There was no conditions to it. There was no transparency. So how that funding would be used, we would really need to have clear criteria on that. I want to just mention about the piece about the GDP, because I think that's an interesting idea, but I think it speaks to a bigger problem of stability and priority right now. So education funding rises and falls with provincial budgets, right? And tying it to GDP, you might be you're saying you're creating stability and you're signaling that education is a national priority. But I think people are looking federally because of all the issues that we're having with funding in provincially and in Ontario. The first line of responsibility still sits with the provinces. A commitment to increase per pupil funding and to restoring all of the funding that has been removed, the $6.3 billion, that is where we need to start.
Thank you very much. And I haven't yet, but I want to respond to one thing. I couldn't agree more about the need to have really tight control and oversight over where it goes. Because I know from my experience, often Francophone language education has specific funding that comes out federally. And that is one of the first things that gets very gray and very slushy in a school that's desperate for resources. So I definitely hear you on that. Éric.
En 15 ans au Québec, c'est 4,4 milliards de coupes en éducation dans les 15 dernières années. Vous comprendrez qu'on ne sera jamais capable de récupérer tout cet argent-là. Et tout à l'heure, je réfléchissais à la question en me disant, je suis convaincu que le fédéral pourrait aider notre gouvernement provincial parce que depuis 15 ans, il prend énormément de mauvaises décisions en éducation. Et ça, ben, je pense que quand on parle de violence, quand on parle la violence, c'est national, c'est pour tout le monde. Et moi, je suis convaincu que le fédéral pourrait venir apporter, oui, pas juste une aide financière, mais peut-être aussi une expertise à toutes les provinces. Je sais que chez nous, on a rapatrié quand même les pouvoirs en éducation, mais malheureusement, c'est des pouvoirs à des politiciens qui ont été donnés, pas à des enfants dans le besoin, pas à des étudiants dans le besoin, pas à des gens, des enseignants, du personnel de soutien, du personnel professionnel qui en profitent de ça. Elle n'est pas là, l'argent. Et c'est des coupes par-dessus coupes. Et vous savez, la santé mentale, la violence scolaire, c'est un enjeu qui est national. Donc, pour nous, effectivement, qu'il devrait y avoir clairement des solutions et travailler de plus en plus aussi avec le fédéral pour pouvoir nous aider parce que malheureusement, au Québec, on a subi beaucoup plus qu'on a investi. Et ça fait mal. Puis 15 ans, là, imaginez, là, c'est un enfant qui est arrivé à 5 ans en maternelle, qui est sorti à 20 ans, qui est rendu pour nous au cégep, au collège. Bien, il y a complètement une génération qu'on a perdue, là, quelque part. Il faut quand même le voir comme ça à travers tous ces couples-là. Des enfants qui avaient des besoins, des enfants. Donc, pour nous, oui, des discussions avec le fédéral, mais je pense que nous tous ensemble pourrions former une belle collaboration pour démontrer une force et mettre une pression sur l'ensemble des gouvernements parce que vivement le changement.
Merci, Éric. And I think for me, that's this question and your response ties into what you said earlier as well about the disconnect and the lack of working together by the different groups, provincial often, but there is a federal interest. It is our whole communities that are suffering. So, Norberta?
Talked about was that tiered approach of looking at, because first off, looking at one of the reports that our own BCTF did in 2022, 2023, there was such a disparity amongst the provinces of how much they spent per pupil. In fact, Quebec spent $4,000 more than BC and $3,000 more than Alberta. And so, and just looking at that, I would hate just thinking about the question makes me feel I would hate for a system of any transfer for a province to like let it maybe sit back. And so that your suggestion of where it's both my colleagues were very clear and targeted in specific in dollars that equate to initiatives and programs that are going to problem solve. That's going to be key. It's not about the money, it's where it goes. This is a problem that happens in every school. Every school gets money, but it comes down to priorities. And sometimes worker safety is not, no, I'm gonna retract that. It's not that, it's just that they can't. The way I envision it is it's like a floor that's been curled back. You put a cone there to protect someone from tripping over that. And where we're at in a system is that there's enough money only for more cones, not for a new floor. So this is where we really need to be intentional, direct, and hold the system accountable for where that money goes. Because and I agree with them both wholeheartedly. You beautifully spoke on the needs. It's not about more money. As educators, we're saying, oh, you just want more money. No, we want targeted money. We want, in a classroom, we want specialists to be able to address. One of the things I didn't mention that we need, that has to be mentioned about violence in schools is that we culturally have an acceptance for children to say that they cannot work with women or work with a particular cultural group and say that. How does that rub against our human rights? And where do we have acceptance of basic behaviors that we witness and we're asked and tasked to work around? So this is what's really important, that we also speak very candidly of what we're witnessing and what we're tolerating. Another example is telling, it's particularly in primary, educational assistants or teachers, I guess from now on to mitigate the risk, wear Kevlar gloves. I would really like to see a change to that.
Thank you, Norberta. Yeah, two things. There's definitely going to be some people in Parliament who are hearing your cone analogy. I love that one. I'm stealing it unabashedly. But also, I think you're right that they say we always want more money. And I think we need to frame it as no, we're not actually asking for anything. We are conveying the message from children who are showing us every day that they do not have enough. And that's a message we're passing on. It's not coming from us. I'm going to skip another question because I think you've made it very clear. We were going to ask where you thought this would lead, what schools would be like or what children would be like. And I think we don't need to go where, we're already there and you've made it clear. So the one I will ask you though, and I'm going to try to hold you to a pretty tight 1 minute response, if I may, so brace yourself, Norberta, is what Darcy brought up at the very beginning. And it's a bit of a cognitive leap. It might be a hard public conversation, but designating schools as hazardous workplaces. And I think if it were any other trade or area of work, the numbers would make this a no-brainer. But we acknowledge where we are and who we work with and what we look like. But that concept, hazardous workplaces, that's what schools are. What do you think?
That's not, that comment is not, or that kind of focus is not landing in the same way for me as I believe framing it as we are working with the vulnerable sector. And I think looking at that and all the approaches, all the initiatives to recognize that we're working with the vulnerable sector, and that requires that intention necessitates for us to have the resources, have the ability to address the situation of violence and aggression at schools, to make it the environment. It's just from my teaching and my counseling perspective and working in schools right now, I find it removes from the kids. So I would like to bring it back to the children that we work with, the children that we're with. They are the vulnerable sector. And there's a requirement to serve, protect, and teach these children as we should. It behooves us to do everything that we can to provide everything that we can to those children and the resources. And that means keeping them safe. And the focus is on the child. So that there's my response. So probably less a bit more than a minute. But.
No, I appreciate that perspective. I've begun to use the phrase, we are failing the promise we made to Canada's children. And in that sense, if we made a promise to them about what it would be like when they went to school and what they would get. Éric.
Moi, c'est sûr qu'au départ de tout, nos politiciens nous disent toujours, bon, il y a de la violence dans les écoles, l'école est de plus dangereuse, mais c'est toujours dans le discours. Le geste ne se rend pas. Mais qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire pour diminuer cette violence? Je vous l'ai dit tout à l'heure. Il faut travailler en amont. Il faut travailler plus loin que l'école un peu pour pouvoir voir arriver cette violence-là et nous donner une école saine et sécuritaire pour tous. Pour tous. De l'élève à l'étudiant, aux jeunes adultes, à tous les gens qui y travaillent. Je pense que ça, c'est un automatisme. Il faut y aller en ce sens-là. Vous savez, on a à un moment donné au Québec dépensé des millions pour une campagne qui s'est terminée avec des affiches dans les écoles avec un numéro de téléphone. Appelez si vous êtes victime de violence. Je vois des gens qui rient dans la salle parce qu'ils savent très bien de quelle situation que c'est. Imaginez-vous qu'un enfant ou qu'un étudiant ou qu'un adulte subit de la violence, va prendre le temps de prendre le téléphone, appeler au numéro, et plus souvent qu'autrement, c'est engagé ou ça ne répondait pas. Donc, c'était toujours, au Québec, on a une problématique, c'est surtout pour bien paraître. Dans le commun des mortels, on lance une idée, un message, et ce que ça fait, c'est qu'on est tout le temps en train de dire, les gens qui travaillent en éducation, bien que ça n'arrive pas à notre niveau dans l'école, dans la classe, dans le salon étudiant, etc. Donc, ça, c'est une des problématiques. Vous savez, quand on a fait nos sondages, puis nous, on fonctionne par demande d'accès à l'information. Donc, on demande ces chiffres-là au gouvernement. Donc, à partir de là, c'est leurs chiffres à eux. Donc, ils ne peuvent pas me dire la vérité. Ils ont l'obligation de répondre à ma demande d'accès à l'information. Quand on a fait nos sondages, on s'est aperçu que de nombreux centres de services scolaires chez nous ne tenaient pas de registre sur la violence vécue dans le milieu de travail ou entre les élèves. Ils ne tenaient pas de registre. Donc, vous comprendrez que pendant 20 ans, 30 ans, on a bien eu beau se parler de violence, mais ils ne tenaient pas de registre. Donc, tu ne tiens pas de registre, tu n'as pas de solution, donc tu n'essayes pas de régler la situation. Donc, ça, on s'est aperçu de ça dans le constat de tout ça. Le manque de suivi, bien entendu, hein? On pose des questions, oui, mais jamais des réponses claires, jamais des solutions concrètes. On en amène. Et vous comprendrez que moi, ce que je dis toujours, c'est qu'il faut trouver un équilibre. Il faut trouver un équilibre entre conséquences et accompagnement dans tout ça. Tu sais, là, il faut trouver un équilibre pour que, enfin, nous puissions avoir des écoles saines et sécuritaires pour tout le monde. Et nous, au Québec, on a une autre situation, puis peut-être chez vous aussi, mais les directions d'école sont de plus en plus absents dans les écoles. Ils ne sont pas là souvent. Donc, ce que ça crée, c'est qu'à un moment donné, ben, le point de référence, ben, c'est des gens qui répondent à éteindre des feux au fur et à mesure. Donc, dans des situations de crise, il y a une crise qui n'est pas terminée, il y en a un autre qui part, un enseignant se fait frapper. Donc, c'est un feu roulant et c'est pour ça que les gens quittent. Les gens quittent, vont faire autre chose parce qu'ils trouvent ça dur, difficile. Mais à quand le courage politique d'un gouvernement?
Merci.
Thank you. So there is no question that we cannot ignore the realities of what education sector workers are facing. They're facing violence. And OSSTF, we had a Safe at Schools symposium a couple years ago, and it brought together education union leaders, principals, community agency, all the stakeholders. The sector is not lacking ideas. What is lacking is government action. We put out a list of recommendations. One of them was the creation of regulation that was specific to the education sector under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And this would take into account the unique workplace that is schools. And it would be very similar to the regulations in healthcare and the industrial sector, because we know that generic workplace rules do not adequately reflect school issues. We also advocated to have the requirements, the board's workplace policies, use one single common definition based on the Occupational Health and Safety Act to describe violence, right? We want them to include physical harm, even if you didn't have to go for medical attention. And we want them to include psychological harm. So we are asking, we have a whole list of recommendations on our safeatschools.ca. We're not plugging OSSTF, but we do have a great website with lots of recommendations. We are asking for them to implement properly safety plans. Use safety plans as a tool to help reduce violence. So yes, we have recommendations. We need a government that will act.
I just add something about safety plans.
20 seconds.
20 seconds. Safety plans are only as good as if you have new resources and new opportunities to address them. Because you can have 20 safety plans, but if you have no difference in the resources, you have basically the same safety plan. So
Yes.
that is critical.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
Plan or policy without
that-
resources is an idea.
Yeah.
yes.
10 seconds.
10 seconds. Look what I've started.
Negotiating.
Il faut agir dès maintenant. Il faut agir dès maintenant. Il faut absolument reconnaître la violence comme un enjeu de santé et de sécurité au travail. Ma collègue l'a dit tout à l'heure. Il faut que ça devienne un enjeu. Il faut qu'il y ait un pas de franchi politiquement pour que ça se passe de cette façon-là. Pour qu'à un moment donné, les différents gens qui travaillent autour de l'éducation à prendre des décisions pour nous qui travaillons sur le plancher, puissent se réveiller à un moment donné et dire et prendre les moyens nécessaires pour qu'on se sente tous en sécurité. C'était mon 10 secondes.
Perfect. This is the fantastic thing about being on a stage and on cameras. No one can come drag me off. So I do know what time it is, but I'm going to make an executive decision and we're going to go a little long. I'm sensing really good engagement and we're going to very quickly take one question in the room. I have one of the questions from online participants earlier, but I am going to glare and finger wag at 1 minute for each of you. So do we have a question in the room so that the people here have at least one quick chance to share?
Je vais parler en français. I will speak in French, okay? Merci. Merci pour vos avis, vos conseils, vos orientations politiques. Moi aussi, je crois qu'il faudrait que la politique s'en mêle un peu. Mais moi, je voudrais prendre cet enjeu autrement. Pourquoi? Parce que il y a encore quelques semaines, j'ai eu plusieurs collègues qui venaient me parler de violence. Mais cette fois-ci, parce qu'il y en a qui sont en congé maladie, vous l'avez tous dit, je ne veux pas me répéter. Mais pourquoi je prends l'histoire à l'envers? ça concerne les enfants qui sont assis et qui subissent. Parce que 2 collègues sont venus à moi et elles pleuraient parce que leurs élèves subissent, pleurent, ne veulent plus venir à l'école et les parents sont démunis parce qu'ils ne savent plus quoi faire. Ceux qui ont les moyens s'en vont voir des psychologues, des thérapeutes. Ceux qui n'en ont pas, mais ce sont les enfants qui sont en chute libre à l'école, tant au niveau mental que académique. Est-ce qu'en utilisant aussi ces données-là, on pourrait aussi dire au gouvernement, mais regardez, voilà, vous aviez parlé tantôt de 15 ans, une génération qui vient d'être détruite. Mais les autres encore, qu'est-ce qu'on va faire d'eux? Je ne sais pas. Je voulais juste amener l'histoire, l'enjeu de notre côté, en fait. Merci.
All right, so it's rough, but you do have a minute now. I'm going to bring away. And that context of we advocate for our members, for workers, and that's very real, but there is the children as well in the classroom. And I know you both talked about them. So 1 minute. Norberta.
Thank you for your question and comment. Just like any child that experience an adverse childhood effect growing up, but even any experience, it's positive experience. It's convincing those families that school is not all about the negative experience. It's the positive experiences that happen in the school can give the better picture for each child. So as much as we're talking about violence and there's many beautiful things that happen in the classroom. And so we also need to implore our parents to believe in the system. We're also experiencing a lot of absenteeism. So students are taking away a negative experience and ruminating in that experience in their room or on social media, ruminating on even further. So they need to be back in the school, and positive experiences will counteract that.
Perfect. 1 minute, Éric.
1 minute. La première chose, nous, ce qu'on dit depuis un certain temps, oui, on parle des élèves souvent en difficulté, les élèves qui ont des problèmes d'apprentissage, de comportement, peu importe. Mais il y a aussi l'élève que j'appelle régulier, qui, lui, parfois, se retrouve dans une situation dans la classe où ça déborde et que lui reçoit ça. Et ce que vous me disiez, c'est que ça va même jusqu'à, moi, j'ai vu ça, là, j'ai vu une bataille, j'ai vu une situation, j'ai vu une chaise, j'ai plus le goût d'y retourner à l'école. Ça prend des gens qui sont capables de venir dire, même à cet enfant-là qui n'a pas qui ne l'a pas subi directement, mais qui l'a subi visuellement, ou comment tu vas, toi? Comment tu vis ça, la situation qui est arrivée? Prendre du temps pour ces enfants-là et s'assurer qu'ils ne quitteront pas l'école, qu'ils vont rester à l'école. Et ça, ce que ça fait, c'est que le temps de concertation n'est plus là. L'école est tellement sous haute pression que malheureusement, c'est difficile. Ça va passer par engager plus de personnel, assurément.
Merci.
Yeah, there's no doubt that students are feeling emotional trauma from the violence that they're seeing. We have normalized class evacuations. We have normalized kids not being able to go to the library because there's a meltdown happening. We've normalized a lot of things, and the impact to all the students, not just the ones who are experiencing it or who are the part of it directly. Other classrooms, even if it's not happening in your classroom, there is an impact to everyone. And the impact to students is that we're having disruption to the learning environment, the well-being and the achievement of students. And I'm sorry, but I have to ask myself this question. If the Ontario government is not deliberately making this their plan, underfund the system, create a crisis, erode public trust, privatization.
Mm-hmm. And we've all seen that. We know that plan, right? I'm going to come back to you for 30 seconds this time. I'm going to try. I'm optimistic. The very last thing, because it runs on so well from the last one. So that's a great scenario. How do we protect the child who isn't the perpetrator or necessarily the victim, but is in that space and is experiencing problems? So how do we engage with parents, including those parents on this issue? And what level of accountability, collaboration, cooperation should we be able to expect from parents in addressing a problem that isn't just a school problem, as we've said many times? So what is the role of parents broadly in this? How do we deal with them in 45 seconds? Norberta.
Well, it's having more conversations than we usually do, than just a letter or a notification. I think we need to have some real conversations and have an expectation that, for example, when a child is violent or is aggressive or is dysregulated in the classroom, where do we really meet with the parent and saying, what is happening at home? Have you sought out supports? Are you having difficulty in accessing those supports? And it's really working with the family to see, this is what we're seeing, this is what we're experiencing, but not just, well, we'll see what happens tomorrow. And so that is where we need to start, is resourcing these families.
Beautiful. Éric.
Entièrement d'accord. Les ressources, travailler en amont, aller plus loin, aller vraiment chercher où la situation part. Et je pense qu'une chose qui est importante, c'est de ramener nos parents à l'école. Le sentiment d'appartenance des parents. Moi, quand j'étais tout petit, mon école de quartier, c'était un sentiment d'appartenance. Aller à l'école Tournesol, pour moi, dans mon petit coin là, au Québec, j'étais heureux et j'étais associé à ça. Mes parents, c'était la même chose. Bon, là, la société a changé, mais je pense qu'il faut avoir des parents collaborateurs et développer ce sentiment d'appartenance-là pour qu'ils se sentent inclusifs dans tout ça, pour être capables de trouver des solutions ensemble avec tous les intervenants.
Okay. Sherry-Ann, last word.
We all know that schools work best when we all act like we're on the same page. So we know that the parents, the community, and the school staff, we all want the same thing. I don't mean to badger the Ontario government, but it's deserving.
Oh, they've earned it.
It's unfortunate that the province of Ontario has gotten to creating a climate where they are literally villainizing and mischaracterizing workers within the education sector. And that has created this mistrust where parents now we're painted as selfish, we're painted as privileged, we're painted as not really caring about students. And we know that could be the furthest from the truth. People in the education sector continue to show up every single day, even though we are working under very, very challenging conditions like violence in the workplace. And we need parents to work with us so that we can continue to lobby this government to fund the public education system that everyone deserves.
Fantastic. Thank you. So just one very quick thing before we go. I could spend another hour doing this, but we really are going to get to you. But I think the only thing I would say that is slightly different is I have become very unabashed, and all of the solutions we've talked about, and someone mentioned before, we're not asking for money. I am unabashed. Every meeting I go to and they say, what do you want? I say, first of all, more money. And you can make it into what you want. Make it into people because we don't have enough of those. Make it into resources because we don't have enough of those. Make it into mental health care. But I am asking for more money. And I put that on the table first. And now let's talk about what that's going to do, how it's going to help children and educators across the country. So thank you all very much to you on the panel. Really appreciate it. And to you in the audience and online, really appreciate your patience and participation. Jessie.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Clearly, as President Clint Johnston was indicating, we could have used much more time for this important conversation. It will be continued, however. It truly is clear that violence in schools and classrooms requires urgent and coordinated action. Conversations like this are an important step, and I do hope they will continue, but they must be followed by action. I think we all know that. And this is because every teacher, every education worker, and every child who is a student in our schools across the country deserves to feel safe at school. Whether it's your learning place or your workplace, everyone should feel safe. So we must continue this work. I know the conversation will continue at CTF-FCA in order to inform our ongoing advocacy. And we invite you to join us in our advocacy and also to follow the Canadian Teachers Federation. Thank you again to everyone for participating in this important discussion and for standing up for quality, inclusive, publicly funded public education.